She nearly lost her life saving a child. Hours later, 150 Hell's Angels surrounded the courthouse. Imagine this, an ordinary teacher, a single moment, a knife flashing toward a child, and her choice changes everything. She wasn't part of the club. She wasn't even supposed to be there. But when a knife flashed toward a terrified child, she threw herself in front of it. Minutes later, her body was collapsing on the courthouse steps. And hours later, 150 Hell's Angels roared into town, surrounding the courtroom in total silence. But why would the world's most feared motorcycle brotherhood risk it all for a woman they didn't even know? So, what happened between that knife and those engines? Why did the world's most feared motorcycle brotherhood risk everything for one woman they didn't even know? Stick around, because this isn't just about outlaws or justice. It's about loyalty, sacrifice, and the moment silence became louder than any riot. If you believe some stories are written in blood and engines, subscribe to Heart Tales. Because what you're about to hear will change the way you see brotherhood forever. The courthouse steps were never meant to taste blood, but on that late afternoon, they did. Elena Marquez had only wanted to walk her student, 8-year-old Caleb Foster, across the square after school. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the sandstone pillars, and the chatter of traffic mingled with the laughter of children. For Elena, the day had been ordinary: lessons about multiplication tables, a reading circle, reminders to tuck shirts in and minds on homework. She could not have known that within minutes, her life would be measured not in chalk dust or red pens, but in the edge of a blade. As they neared the courthouse, the air shifted. A crowd gathered, not for justice, but for spectacle. At the center of it all stood Ronan, steel-hand, cane, tall, broad-shouldered, his leather cut marked with the Hell's Angels insignia. He was no stranger to the courthouse. Years of trials and accusations had painted him both villain and legend, depending on who was telling the story. But today, he wasn't on trial. Today, he had come to support a brother facing charges inside. Unbeknownst to most, danger stalked him in plain sight. Derek Vaughn, a gaunt figure with eyes like cold stone, had waited for this moment. He bore the colors of a rival gang, and he carried hatred like fuel. Slipping through the edge of the crowd, he clutched a knife under his jacket. Each step calculated, his mind replaying the fantasy of driving steel into Ronan Kane's chest. Elena noticed first, not the knife, not the intent, but the way the crowd rippled, parting like water disturbed by a predator. Caleb tugged at her hand, sensing her sudden stillness. She scanned the faces, then saw it, Derek's hand flashing from his coat, the glint of a blade catching the sun. Her breath caught. He was charging not toward her, not toward Caleb, but toward Ronan. Yet, in that split second, she saw what he did not: Caleb, frozen, directly in the line of attack. There was no calculation, no weighing of risks. Elena's body moved before her mind could shout reason. She dropped her bag, shoved Caleb backward with all the strength she had, and stepped into the path of the blade. The steel struck deep into her shoulder, hot agony ripping through flesh and muscle. She gasped, legs buckling, but she did not scream. Blood blossomed instantly across her blouse, stark against the fabric. The crowd shrieked in horror, scattering, but Elena's eyes were only on Caleb, who stared wide-eyed, trembling, yet unharmed. Ronan's reaction was volcanic. He lunged forward, catching Elena before she collapsed fully onto the stone steps. His arms, usually meant for fists and fury, cradled her like something precious. Around him, his men roared in outrage, fists slamming Derek Vaughn to the ground before he could strike again. Police surged forward, wrestling to regain control, sirens blaring as backup flooded the square. Elena blinked through the haze of pain, vision narrowing to Ronan's face. For a moment, she saw not the hardened captain of a notorious club, but a man blindsided by a kind of sacrifice he'd never known. "The boy," she whispered, voice weak. "Make sure he's safe." Ronan glanced toward Caleb, now scooped up by a bystander and held tight, alive because of her. His jaw clenched. He looked back down at Elena, fury and guilt warring in his eyes. "You hold on," he ordered, as if his command could tether her to life. Derek Vaughan was dragged away in cuffs, laughing through split lips. "She won't survive this," he spat, blood on his teeth, his words cutting sharper than the knife had, searing into Ronan's ears. Paramedics arrived, kneeling beside Elena, working fast, pressing gauze against the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Ronan refused to let go. His presence immovable, even as they strapped her onto a stretcher. His leather vest was soaked crimson, but he didn't seem to notice. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Caleb tried to rush forward, tears streaking his face, but a deputy held him back. His cries pierced the air, "She saved me. She saved me." Those words carried farther than the sirens, imprinting themselves on everyone who heard. The ambulance doors slammed shut. Ronan mounted the step, forcing himself inside despite the protests of medics. He wasn't going to let her vanish into sterile corridors without him. The engines of his men's bikes rumbled alive, forming a thunderous escort behind the flashing lights as the ambulance sped away. On the courthouse steps, blood still stained the stone. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras rolled, and townsfolk whispered the story already: a schoolteacher who had taken a knife meant for the captain of the Hells Angels, and for a child who never would have seen another sunrise. It was the beginning of something none of them could stop, something that would swell beyond the courthouse square, beyond the town itself. Because by nightfall, whispers would reach across state lines, carried on the roar of engines. She nearly lost her life saving a child, and the angels will not forget. The sirens screamed through the square, scattering the crowd as officers dragged Derek Vaughan down the steps in handcuffs. He spat blood and laughter in equal measure, his voice rising above the chaos. "She won't make it," he jeered, eyes flashing with twisted satisfaction. "She spilled her blood for you, Cain. Let's see how long she lasts." His words struck Ronan, steel hand, Cain harder than any fist ever had. Inside the ambulance, Elena lay pale, drifting in and out of consciousness as paramedics worked feverishly to stem the bleeding. Ronan sat hunched beside her, massive hands clenched tight, stained in her blood. He had faced ambushes, survived shootouts, walked away from crashes that should have ended him. But this, watching an innocent teacher bleed out because she had thrown herself between him and a child, this was different. It carved something raw into his chest, something he couldn't shake. The ambulance tore down streets, lights slicing through traffic until it skidded into the hospital bay. Nurses rushed forward, yanking open the doors. Ronan jumped out before they could block him, his boots heavy against the pavement, his eyes locked on Elena as they wheeled her inside. He followed, ignoring shouts to stay back. In the waiting area, chaos had already arrived. Reporters flooded in, snapping photos, whispering frantically into phones. Police officers moved to establish order, their radios buzzing with updates from the courthouse. Caleb Foster, still shaken, clung to his mother's waist, tears streaking his face as he repeated the same words over and over: "She saved me. She saved me." The boy's voice carried, echoing across the sterile halls until even strangers whispered the phrase like a refrain. Meanwhile, Derek Vaughan was shoved into a squad car outside, blood dripping from his split lip. Cameras caught him smirking through the window bars, unrepentant. "Let her die," he mouthed, before the cruiser sped away. That image would splash across news channels within the hour, igniting both outrage and fear. Ronan stood near the emergency doors, his leather vest streaked with blood, fists clenched as nurses vanished with Elena behind swinging doors. He felt powerless, a sensation he despised. His men arrived in waves, boots stomping through the corridors, their presence drawing weary looks from staff and officers alike. Mick O'Donnell, his oldest friend and war-seasoned brother, stepped forward, eyes scanning the chaos. "She's still in there," Ronan nodded stiffly. "She's fighting." Mick's voice lowered, gravelly. "Word spreading already. By nightfall, every chapter from here to Nevada will know. A teacher took a blade meant for Steelhand Cain. They'll ride for this, Ronan." You know they will. And he was right. Outside the hospital, phones buzzed in every clubhouse, every garage where patch jackets hung. The story was simple, but it hit like lightning. A woman nearly died saving a child from a rival's blade, standing in front of the Angel's captain. Within hours, engines were firing up on highways. Convoys rolled out, headlamps cutting lines through the night. The roar of V-twin engines carrying news faster than any headline. Back inside, officers cornered Ronan, their voices low but tense. Kane, your people need to leave. This is a hospital, not your clubhouse. You're intimidating staff and patients. Ronan's eyes burned into them, his tone lethal but controlled. She's here because of me. She's not alone until she walks out breathing. You want quiet? Then keep your men in line and let mine stand outside. They'll guard her better than you ever could. The officer flinched under the weight of his stare. No one pushed further. Hours dragged, the sterile clock ticking too loud. Reporters filled every corner, whispering about the trial ahead, how Derek Vaughn would be arraigned at the courthouse in less than 24 hours, and how the angels were already gathering for it. The air thickened with anticipation, dread, and a strange kind of awe. Behind the operating room doors, Elena's life balanced on a knife's edge. Surgeons bent over her, their voices clipped, blood pooling faster than they could replace it. Twice her heart faltered, monitors shrieking, and twice they dragged her back from the brink. Each time, the weight outside the doors grew heavier, as if hundreds of boots pressed against the tile in silent prayer. By midnight, Mick leaned against the wall beside Ronan, arms crossed. This ain't just about you anymore, he said quietly. That kid out there, he saw her bleed so he could live. That courtroom tomorrow, it won't just be about Vaughn. It'll be about her. About what happens when innocence bleeds in our wars. Ronan didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the red light above the operating room, burning like an omen. But inside, his thoughts raced. He had lived by loyalty his entire life. But tonight, he had seen it given by someone with no patch, no oath, no stake in his brotherhood. Elena Marquez had redefined the word with one desperate act. And as the night deepened, engines rumbled in the distance, one by one, until the sound became a chorus. The angels were coming. Not to fight, not yet, but to stand. By morning, the world would know a woman had nearly lost her life saving a child, and the Hell's Angels were about to make sure the courtroom felt the weight of her sacrifice. The red light above the operating room glowed like a warning beacon, and every second it stayed on felt like an eternity. Ronan stood unmoving, shoulders tense, his eyes locked on that door as though he could force it open with sheer will. Around him, the waiting area had transformed into something unreal. Leather jackets with winged skulls filled the sterile hospital, their patches a stark rebellion against white walls and antiseptic air. Nurses whispered nervously. Patients stared, but no one dared ask them to leave. Elena Marquez lay under a canopy of surgical lamps, her chest rising shallowly, her body pale against the sterile sheets. Surgeons worked with swift precision, hands slick with blood, suction whirring, clamps clicking. The knife had missed her heart by inches, but the damage was catastrophic, muscle shredded, artery torn. Twice her pulse flatlined, the sound of the monitor turning the room to ice. And twice they shocked her back, her body jerking under the electric current. Each time, a surgeon muttered, "Come on, Elena, don't let go." Back outside, Ronan paced, fists clenching and unclenching, his vest stiff with dried blood. A nurse finally approached him. "She's losing blood faster than we can replace it. We're calling for universal donors, but, take mine," Ronan cut in instantly. She blinked. "Sir, we can't just, type O negative," he barked. "Universal donor. Tested in the core. Take it." The nurse hesitated, then nodded sharply, motioning him down the hall. Minutes later, Ronan sat in a chair, sleeve rolled up, veins bulging as blood flowed into a plastic bag. His jaw clenched, not from the needle's sting, but from the helplessness he despised. For once, he couldn't throw a punch or bark in order to fix this. All he could do was bleed for her, as she had bled for him. But even this sacrifice was not enough. A doctor appeared, shaking his head. "We'll take it. But she needs more than blood. She needs time. Time we may not have." Ronan's eyes narrowed. "Then you buy it. Do whatever it takes. She didn't take that blade to die in your hands." The doctor's gaze faltered under the weight of his fury, but he turned back without argument. By dawn, news vans lined the street outside, their satellites pointing skyward, headlines spreading like wildfire: "Schoolteacher saves child, stabbed protecting Hell's Angels leader." Talk shows buzzed. Some painted her as a hero, others as reckless, tangled in a world she didn't belong to. But none could deny the image already burned into the public's mind: Elena on the courthouse steps, bleeding but unbroken, her body a shield between innocence and violence. At the courthouse itself, preparations for Derek Vaughn's arraignment began. Extra police ringed the building. Barricades stacked high, officers whispering nervously about the bikers who had already begun to gather at the edges of town. Vaughn sat smugly in a holding cell, his lips split, eyes cold. "They'll come," he sneered to the guard outside his bars. "And when they do, you'll see what loyalty really means." But Vaughn had no idea. He thought loyalty belonged to men with colors on their backs. He hadn't seen what Ronan had seen, that loyalty could live in a teacher with chalk on her hands and nothing to gain. Back at the hospital, Mick O'Donnell leaned against the window, watching the parking lot fill with motorcycles. "They're not leaving, Ronan. They'll stay planted until she walks out those doors. And tomorrow, they'll ride to that courthouse, whether you call for it or not." Ronan stared at the hallway that led to Elena's room, his voice low, hard. "Let them come. This isn't just about me anymore. She earned every engine, every mile. If she makes it through this, the world's going to know her name. And if she doesn't," his voice cracked, just once, but he steadied it, "if she doesn't, then tomorrow, the courthouse won't hear a trial. It'll hear thunder." Mick nodded solemnly. Outside, the first light of morning broke, glinting off chrome and steel. The engines rumbled like a storm building on the horizon. Inside, Elena's monitor beeped steadily, fragile but fighting. Between the walls of the hospital and the walls of the courthouse, two battles were being drawn, one for her life, and one for justice. And both were only just beginning. By the time the sun had fully risen, the hospital no longer looked like a hospital. It looked like the edge of a battlefield. The steady roar of engines filled the morning air, echoing through every street for blocks. One by one, then in dozens, motorcycles lined the perimeter. Chrome gleamed in the sunlight. Black leather jackets flapped in the breeze. And on every back, the same patch stared back at the world, the winged skull of the Hell's Angels. Inside, staff crowded at windows, their whispers rising with each new convoy that rolled in. Some were terrified, convinced violence was about to spill through the doors. Others were awestruck, watching a force gather that even the police seemed reluctant to challenge. Nurses murmured nervously about safety, but patients felt a strange sense of protection, as if no harm could cross those parking lots without facing thunder. Ronan stood just inside the entrance, his presence unmistakable, flanked by Mick and half a dozen lieutenants. His face was carved from stone, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. But his silence spoke louder than fury. For once, he wasn't barking orders. He didn't have to. Every man who wore the patch knew why they were there. Cameras arrived next, flashing like lightning strikes. Reporters clutched microphones, speaking into the chaos. Hundreds of Hell's Angels have surrounded St. Augustine Medical Center after a local schoolteacher nearly lost her life saving a child and protecting their captain, Ronan Kane. Tensions are rising as the arraignment of her attacker looms tomorrow morning. Police cruisers circled like nervous animals, lights flashing, but they didn't move in. The sight of so many bikers, silent, unarmed in appearance, but carrying a presence heavier than weapons, kept them at bay. Negotiators approached Ronan at the doors. "Kane, this isn't a rally. You need to tell your people to go home. This is intimidating. It's dangerous." Ronan's reply was calm, measured. "She nearly died because of us. They're not here to fight. They're here to make sure she doesn't leave this world alone. You want them gone. Then make sure she walks out breathing. Until then, they stay." The officer tried again, but the truth was plain. There was no dispersing 300 men who had ridden all night to stand vigil. They weren't chanting. They weren't threatening. They were simply there, engines rumbling like a heartbeat beneath the city. Inside, Elena's condition wavered between hope and despair. In the ICU, monitors beeped steadily, but fragile. Oxygen hissed. 4 bags dripped. Doctors whispered about odds. But the nurses closest to her spoke of something else, grit. Twice they had seen her heart stutter. Twice she had clawed back. They couldn't explain it medically, but they felt it. This woman wasn't ready to leave. Meanwhile, public opinion fractured on TV screens across the country. Anchors debated. Some called Elena a hero who embodied sacrifice. Others warned she had been reckless, putting herself in the middle of outlaw violence. Commentators clashed. But the footage of Caleb Foster crying on the courthouse steps, screaming, "She saved me," tilted hearts in her favor. Hashtags blazed across social media, #StandWithElena. Back at the hospital, Mick leaned against a wall, arms crossed, watching the parking lot fill with yet another convoy. "Never seen anything like it," he muttered. "We've ridden for brothers. We've ridden for funerals. But never for someone without a patch." Ronan didn't look away from the ICU doors. His voice was low, almost reverent. "She earned it. That blade was meant for me. And she stood where no one else would." The weight of his words traveled through his men, binding them in silence. Loyalty had always been their code, but Elena Marquez had redefined it. As evening fell, candles appeared outside, lit by townsfolk who gathered hesitantly near the rows of bikes. At first, it was only a few, then dozens. Parents, neighbors, even strangers who had seen the headlines stood shoulder to shoulder with leather-clad giants. A vigil was forming, not of fear, but of unity. The hospital administrator, overwhelmed, finally approached Ronan. "This can't go on. You have hundreds of bikers outside, civilians lighting candles. We don't have the resources for this kind of crowd." Ronan removed his glasses, his eyes hard but steady. "Then understand this. She didn't ask for this, but she's got it anyway. No one leaves until she does. This isn't about control. It's about respect. And if you can't handle that, then step aside." The administrator faltered. For once, the outlaw spoke with a gravity that even authority couldn't dismiss. By nightfall, the hospital had transformed completely. Engines rumbled in shifts, some idling low, others shutting off only to spark back alive an hour later. Candles flickered against chrome and leather. Television crews broadcast live images of the vigil, 300 bikers, unyielding, guarding the fragile breath of a schoolteacher inside. And in the center of it all, Elena still fought for her life. Every beep of her monitor answered outside by the steady thrum of motorcycles, as if a pact had been sealed between her heartbeat and their engines. Morning broke with a kind of tension that felt carved into the air itself. The courthouse stood rigid against the pale sky, its steps cordoned off by rows of steel barricades and riot police bristling with shields. News vans swarmed every block, cables snaking across sidewalks, their cameras pointed not at the marble columns, but at the thunder rolling toward them. The sound came first, low, steady, a rumble that grew into something primal. Engines, dozens, then hundreds. Within minutes, the narrow streets were choked with chrome and leather, the glint of patches catching the rising sun. 150 Hell's Angels, some from as far as 3 states away, filled the courthouse square. They did not shout. They did not riot. They parked, killed their engines, and stood shoulder to shoulder, arms folded, vests gleaming with history and loyalty. The silence was heavier than any chant could have been. Reporters leaned into their mics, narrating history in the making. This morning, members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club have surrounded the courthouse where Derek Vaughn, accused of the stabbing of schoolteacher Elena Marquez, will be arraigned. The sheer presence of the group has paralyzed the city. Inside a holding cell, Vaughn smirked, his lips still split, his swagger untouched. To him, this was all proof of his infamy. He spat onto the floor, muttering to the guard, "See that? They're not here for her. They're here for me. To prove they're bigger than the law. You'll see." But Vaughn was wrong. Dead wrong. Back at the hospital, Elena still clung to life, her chest rising with fragile rhythm, every breath stitched together by willpower and machines. Nurses updated Ronan hourly, but he refused to leave, even as his men kept vigil at the courthouse. He spoke only once that morning, his voice rough. "Tell them to stand. No noise, no fights. Just stand. Let the world see loyalty without a weapon raised." And so they did. The courthouse became a theater of silence. Police lined the barricades, tense fingers on batons, their radios spitting static as superiors barked updates, "Maintain control. No engagement unless provoked." Yet no provocation came. The bikers stood like stone, their eyes fixed on the courthouse doors, their very presence making the ground feel unsteady beneath suited lawyers and hurried clerks. Mick O'Donnell walked the line, checking with chapters, nodding at familiar faces hardened by miles of asphalt and scars of old wars. Some men had ridden through the night, exhaust still warm, eyes bloodshot but unflinching. Every one of them knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about Ronan. It wasn't even just about Elena. It was about proving that sacrifice did not vanish into silence, that when someone bled for innocence, the world would answer with thunder. At 9 sharp, Vaughn was led into the courtroom, shackled, chin high. His eyes darted toward the windows, where faint sunlight filtered through the glass. Beyond it, he knew the angels waited. His smirk widened. To him, they were an audience. But inside, the narrative had already shifted. Caleb Foster, his small frame dwarfed by the wooden bench, sat clutching his mother's hand. His voice, shaky but brave, echoed as he repeated what had become the refrain of this trial, "She saved me." Jurors glanced at him, their hardened expressions softening. The press caught every word, scribbling, broadcasting, amplifying. In the gallery, lawyers whispered about the optics, a child's testimony, a city under watch, 300 angels at a hospital, another 150 at the courthouse. This wasn't just a case, it was a crucible. Back outside, a young reporter broke the silence to ask Mick, "Why are you here? Why risk this?" Mick's answer was short, gravel rolling in his throat. "Because she didn't wear a patch. She didn't take an oath, but she lived it. And when someone like that bleeds for one of ours, we don't let the world forget it." The quote hit airwaves within minutes. Hashtags flared, hashtag she saved me, hashtag stand for Elena, hashtag thunder at the courthouse. Public sentiment surged, painting Vaughn not as a provocateur, but as a coward who struck where innocence lived. Inside, Vaughn's arrogance cracked for the first time. He saw the judge's stern face, the jury's tight jaws, the child's trembling words, and though he masked it with a smirk, sweat traced down his temple. The judge called order. The arraignment began. Charges read aloud, each word heavy, each syllable weighed against the silence pressing from outside. Vaughn entered his plea, defiant. But the sound was drowned in the minds of everyone present by the phantom roar of engines. Because even though the motorcycles were silent, their presence spoke volumes. It was as though every piston, every mile, every oath stood in that courtroom alongside Elena's fight for life. And though no verdict came that day, one truth had already been delivered: a woman had nearly lost her life saving a child, and in answer, the angels had surrounded the law itself, not with violence, but with vigilance. The hospital at dawn was quieter than the courthouse, but only just. Outside, the rumble of engines still came in waves as bikers rotated shifts, holding the vigil like sentinels of steel and leather. Candles burned low in wax puddles along the curb, the faint scent of smoke mixing with antiseptic drifting from inside. Elena Marquez lay in the ICU, her body pale, the monitors tracing fragile lines of life. For hours, she'd hovered in a limbo where doctors whispered odds and nurses traded glances they didn't want families to see. Her pulse had fluttered, stuttered, vanished, only to return in sparks of defiance. And then, as dawn spread pale light through the blinds, something shifted. A faint movement, fingers twitching against the sheets, eyelids flickering like they fought through a storm. A nurse froze, eyes wide, then leaned close. "Elena, can you hear me?" Her lips parted, dry, soundless at first, then a whisper, "The boy, is he safe?" Tears welled instantly in the nurse's eyes. She bolted from the room, shouting for the doctors. "She's awake. She's back." Within moments, the ICU filled with white coats and hushed orders, "Check vitals. Stabilize her airway. Neurological response good." Elena's eyes opened wider, pupils adjusting to the harsh light. Pain lanced through her chest where the blade had struck, but clarity followed. She remembered the courthouse steps, the child's scream, the flash of steel, and the weight of Ronan pulling her down before darkness swallowed her whole. Doctors were stunned. By every measure, she shouldn't have been conscious. Not yet. "It's remarkable," one murmured. "She's fought through trauma most don't survive." Word spread fast. Within an hour, Mick O'Donnell stormed into the ICU waiting area, his face breaking into the first genuine smile anyone had seen in days. "She's awake," he barked into his phone, and miles away at the courthouse, Ronan heard it. The captain closed his eyes for a moment, shoulders finally loosening. He didn't smile, he never did in public, but the relief was carved in every line of his face. He turned to his men and gave a single nod. "She's alive. Hold the line." Outside the hospital, the crowd reacted before official word even came. A whisper moved through the bikers like electricity, "She made it." She opened her eyes. Engines fired spontaneously, roaring in salute, their thunder shaking windows. Civilians gathered nearby clapped, some weeping, the vigil transforming into celebration. Reporters scrambled, shouting into cameras, "Breaking news, Elena Marquez, the teacher who was critically wounded saving a child, has regained consciousness." Inside, Elena's first request wasn't for family or even for herself. "The boy," she rasped again. Nurses reassured her, Caleb was safe, his mother by his side. Relief softened her expression, though the pain, etched deep into her body, kept her rooted to the bed. Ronan arrived an hour later. The hospital administrators didn't want him inside. Police argued it would send the wrong signal, but Elena herself asked for him when she learned he was there. They relented. When he stepped into the ICU, the air shifted, his massive frame dwarfing the machines, his vest dark against sterile walls. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied her, the woman who had stepped between him and death. "You shouldn't be here," Elena whispered, voice weak but steady. "You shouldn't either," Ronan replied, his voice low, rough. "That blade wasn't yours to take." Her lips trembled, but her eyes held firm. "The boy was in the way. I couldn't let him," he cut her off with a shake of his head, the faintest crack in his hardened exterior. "You bled for him. You bled for me. And now, 150 men stand outside that courthouse because you showed them what loyalty looks like." Elena's brow furrowed, confusion flickering through her haze. "They what?" "Every chapter within a day's ride," Mick said from the corner, voice softer than usual. "They surrounded the courthouse at dawn. No fists, no fights, just standing there for you." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her temples. Not from fear, not from pain, but from the weight of it, the realization that a single act had bound her to a brotherhood she never asked for. Doctors urged them to leave, to let her rest. But before Ronan turned to go, she whispered one last thing, "Promise me, the boy never sees that knife again." Ronan met her gaze, and for once, there was no outlaw, no captain, just a man who understood the price of innocence. "I promise." By evening, news of her awakening had eclipsed everything else. The vigil outside grew brighter with candles and louder with engines. #soared. Headlines shifted, "She woke up" flashed across living rooms and smartphones. People felt it, that rare moment where survival itself felt like a victory greater than any verdict. But for Ronan, for Mick, for every biker in leather who had stood in silence, it was more than a victory. It was a vow. Because if Elena had clawed her way back from death, then tomorrow's battle at the courthouse would not be for a memory. It would be for her future. The morning of the trial felt like a storm before it broke. The courthouse loomed under gray skies, its steps once again guarded by barricades and lines of officers with taut shoulders and watchful eyes. Beyond them, the bikers stood, rows of leather, chrome, and steel, silent as ever, engines idling like a chorus of restrained thunder. This wasn't chaos. It was discipline, and it unnerved everyone in power. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Reporters packed the gallery, their lenses hungry for any flicker of drama. Legal clerks shuffled papers, whispering about how no case in years had drawn such scrutiny. It wasn't just about Derek Vaughan anymore. It was about what Elena Marquez had come to represent, a schoolteacher turned reluctant symbol of sacrifice, a woman who had bled for a child and, against all odds, awakened again. In the ICU across town, Elena insisted on being propped up, a portable monitor wheeled to her side so she could hear the live broadcast. Doctors protested, but her resolve was iron. Weak breaths rattled through her lungs, yet her voice was clear, "If I risked my life to save him, then I'll hear if the law is willing to do the same." Caleb Foster sat on the witness bench, his small hands clenched together, his mother's arm around his shoulders. His testimony had already struck the jury, but today, his presence carried more weight than words. He was the living reminder of what Elena had done, and no defense argument could erase the innocence in his eyes. The defense tried anyway. They painted Vaughan as a victim of circumstance, provoked, misunderstood. His lawyer spoke of freedom, of overreach, of prejudice against an outsider. But each sentence fell flatter than the last, drowned beneath the unspoken counterpoint. A woman had nearly died shielding a child, and the man responsible smirked as if proud of it. And smirk he did. Vaughan lounged in his chair, shackles rattling when he shifted, his grin aimed at the jurors as though daring them to look away. Every now and then, he glanced toward the windows, imagining the engines outside roaring for him, not against him. His arrogance filled the room like smoke. But the smoke thinned when the prosecutor spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice calm but sharp, "this isn't about motorcycle patches or reputations. It's about a teacher who stepped between a blade and a boy. It's about intent." Derek Vaughan raised a weapon to kill, and only Elena Marquez's courage stopped him from succeeding. The words rang in the chamber. The jury's eyes hardened. Vaughan's smirk faltered. Back outside, the angels held their vigil tighter. News anchors framed the moment live. If the verdict sways toward leniency, the city braces for unrest. But so far, the bikers remained silent, waiting, watching. Mick O'Donnell paced the line, his jaw tight. He spoke only once to a nearby rider, "We don't move. Not unless Ronan says. This isn't our courtroom. It's hers." And at that same moment, in her hospital bed, Elena whispered to the nurse adjusting her, "Whatever they decide, promise me they hear the truth. Promise me Caleb doesn't grow up thinking silence wins." The nurse squeezed her hand, tears brimming. "He won't. Not after you." Hours stretched. Deliberation began. The jury filed out, leaving the courtroom in a breathless hush. Reporters scribbled, cameras waited, engines rumbled like distant thunder. For the angels, for Elena, for Caleb, time itself seemed to stall. The world held its breath for a verdict that would decide not just one man's fate, but the meaning of her sacrifice. And when the jury finally returned, the courthouse erupted in silence so thick it was deafening. The jury filed back into the chamber, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding contact with Vaughn's swaggering grin. The foreman clutched a folded slip of paper, his knuckles white, the weight of 12 voices trembling in his hand. The judge's gavel cracked once. Order. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? A pause, a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then the foreman rose. We have, Your Honor. Vaughn leaned back, smirking, convinced of his invincibility. To him, this was still a game, still a stage. But when the words left the foreman's mouth, his smirk broke. On the charge of attempted murder, guilty. A wave crashed through the courtroom. Gasps, cries, a sharp murmur that swelled into a roar before the judge pounded his gavel. Order. I will have order in this court. The list of charges continued: assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment. Each one punctuated with the same word, guilty. With every repetition, Vaughn's posture shrank, his grin melted, his eyes darted, sweat rolling down his temples. The shackles at his wrists seemed heavier now, binding him not just to the chair, but to the consequences he had thought he could outrun. Across town, in the hospital room, Elena's breath caught when the verdict reached her ears through the live broadcast. Her fragile body shook with emotion, tears blurring her vision. She gripped the nurse's hand, whispering, "Justice for the boy." The nurse smiled through tears. "Justice for you, too." At the courthouse, Caleb clutched his mother tighter. The prosecutor knelt beside him, whispering, "She'll hear you one day when you tell her thank you." Caleb nodded, eyes glistening with relief he didn't yet know how to name. Then came the sound that made the entire city shiver. Outside, the angels' engines roared to life, not in fury, not in rebellion, but in celebration. The thunder rolled through the streets, echoing off marble and glass, reverberating through the courtroom walls. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, their voices trembling over the roar. 150 Hell's Angels are unleashing a victory salute. This city has never seen anything like it. Mick O'Donnell stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on the courthouse doors. "We came for justice," he muttered, the engines vibrating the pavement beneath his boots. And she lived to see it. Inside, Vaughn shouted over the noise, his arrogance splintered into desperation. "This isn't over. You can't do this to me. They'll come for me." But the words rang hollow, drowned beneath the sound of brotherhood outside and the gavel declaring, "Defendant is remanded to custody without bail." Ronan, still seated in the gallery, allowed himself one deep breath. His jaw clenched, but his eyes softened for the first time in days. When he rose to leave, his men outside parted, every one of them turning their heads in silent recognition. He lifted a hand, a signal not to riot, not to fight, but to ride. Engines revved in unison, a wall of thunder that shook the air. It wasn't defiance, it was closure. The courthouse steps became a corridor of steel as rows of bikers rolled forward slowly, deliberately, their procession a declaration that justice had been witnessed. Back at the hospital, Elena heard it, too. The roar carried through the open window, faint but steady, like a heartbeat from miles away. She closed her eyes, a smile ghosting her lips. "They're still there," she whispered. "For the boy. For all of us." Doctors urged her to rest, but for the first time, her sleep was peaceful. As the sun broke through the clouds, cameras captured the sight of 150 Hell's Angels riding from the courthouse in formation, their silhouettes stretching long across the asphalt. They didn't leave destruction in their wake. They left a message: loyalty had answered violence, and for once, the law had kept pace with sacrifice. The city would talk about that day for years, the roar that rolled through a courthouse, the teacher who came back from the edge, and the bikers who stood guard not with fists, but with silence and thunder. And beneath it all lingered a truth no verdict could erase. One act of courage had bound strangers, outlaws, and innocents into something larger than fear itself. Weeks passed, and the city slowly exhaled the breath it had been holding since the knife flashed on those courthouse steps. Life resumed, but it wasn't the same. In the hospital, Elena Marquez fought her way back from weakness, inch by inch. Every morning began with pain, the tight pull of scar tissue, the effort it took just to sit upright, but every morning, she pushed forward. Each step down the hallway, each lap with the walker, became proof that sacrifice hadn't broken her. It had remade her. The bikers who had once terrified the community transformed into unlikely guardians. While Elena healed, the angels returned again and again. Some brought flowers, others just stood quietly at the end of the hall, nodding once before leaving. It wasn't showmanship, it was respect. One day, Ronan himself appeared in her doorway, silent for a long moment before speaking. "You bled for one of ours," he said, voice heavy but steady. "That debt doesn't vanish. Ever." Elena managed a faint smile, still pale but stronger now. "I didn't do it for a debt. I did it because he was a child." Ronan's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened. "That's the difference between us. But that's also why we're here." Then he left, as simply as he'd arrived, leaving behind a leather patch on her bedside table. Not the full emblem, but a small token stitched with the letters AFA, always, forever, always, brotherhood's seal of eternal loyalty. The trial's outcome sent ripples far beyond the city. News outlets replayed the footage of 150 engines shaking the courthouse. Commentators argued whether it was intimidation or solidarity. But the people who had been there knew it wasn't fear that silenced the streets that day. It was reverence for Elena, for what courage could look like when one life shielded another. Caleb Foster visited her often, his small hands now holding handmade cards instead of clenching in fear. "My mom says you're like a superhero," he told her once, his eyes wide. Elena laughed softly, though the movement tugged at her scar. "No, Caleb. Heroes wear capes. I just wear scars." But in his eyes, the difference didn't matter. To him, she had saved the world. When she was finally discharged, the hospital entrance became a scene no one expected. Rows of motorcycles lined the street, chrome gleaming in the sunlight, their riders silent and steady. Civilians gathered, murmuring in awe. Elena stepped out with the help of nurses, her steps slow but determined, and the roar that erupted was unlike anything the city had ever heard. 150 engines thundered, not in chaos, not in menace, but in honor. The bikers didn't block traffic or shout slogans. They simply created a corridor of steel and sound, guiding her wheelchair through as if she were royalty returning home. Civilians clapped. Children waved. Reporters' voices cracked as they tried to capture the moment. Elena, tears streaking her face, whispered to herself, "All this, for a teacher." Mick walked beside her, his hands steady on the chair. "Not just for a teacher," he said quietly, leaning close so only she could hear. "For the woman who showed us what loyalty really means." That day became legend. Articles called it the silent salute. Some critics tried to downplay it, but most couldn't deny what they'd seen: bikers and civilians, once divided by fear, united by a single act of sacrifice. Ronan and his men left the city weeks later, engines fading into the horizon, but their imprint lingered. People spoke differently of the angels now, not saints, not outlaws, but something harder to name. And in every telling of the story, Elena's name stood at the center, the teacher who had nearly lost her life saving a boy, and in doing so, redefined what brotherhood could mean. Years later, when Caleb stood at his high school graduation, Elena sat in the audience, scars hidden beneath her blouse, but spirit shining brighter than ever. When his name was called, he searched the crowd, found her, and lifted his diploma high, not for himself, but for her. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of engines. Not 150 this time, not even 50, just a handful of riders parked beyond the parking lot, standing at attention in silence, watching, remembering. Because loyalty, once earned, doesn't fade. It echoes like the rumble of engines down an endless road. And that was the story of Elena Marquez, the schoolteacher who nearly lost her life for a child, and the day 150 Hell's Angels answered with thunder outside a courthouse. What started as a moment of violence turned into something far bigger, a living reminder that sacrifice, loyalty, and justice can change the way an entire city breathes. If this story moved you, take a second to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Heart Tales, where silence, brotherhood, and sacrifice come alive in ways you'll never forget. But now it's your turn. What do you think? Was this the moment that proved loyalty can be louder than fear? Or do you see it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading every one of them. And if you want more stories just like this one, you don't have to wait. Check out the next videos waiting for you on the end screen right now. Thank you for riding through this journey with us.